spreads its ripples throughout the Middle Ages. That move from simple to demonic anti-Judaism, what one Christian historian calls the beginning of a persecuting society. We know mutation 3. We can date that to 1879, when the new word anti-Semitism is coined for the first time by a German journalist called Wilhelm Marr. Fascinating that the word anti-Semitism did not exist before 1879. And all of a sudden, Christian anti-Judaism mutates into racial anti-Semitism. And of course, at that moment, already in 1879, it moves into an altogether darker mood. You see, you can change your faith, but you can't change your race. So whereas Christians could work for the conversion of Jews, racial anti-Semites could only, God forbid, work for the extermination of the Jews. That was 1879. We are living through the fourth mutation. It differs from the others in various respects. Number one, the new anti-Semitism, unlike the old, is not directed against Jews as individuals. It is directed against Jews as a nation with their own state. It is directed primarily, as I say, against the state of Israel, but against all Jews as presumptively Zionists and hence imperialist usurpers and all the rest of it. And all the medieval myths have been recycled. It is Jews who were responsible for 9/11. It was Israel that was responsible for the tsunami. It was the nuclear underwater testing by Israel. You didn't know this. Well, you could have guessed it, right? I mean, I always wonder what they'll blame us for. Have they blamed us for the oil spill yet? Just wait, be patient. They're working on it. And so on. So that is the first characteristic, which didn't exist before, because Jews as a nation state in their own land didn't exist before. In other words, we have 82 at least Christian nations as part of the United Nations. There are 56 Islamic states. There is only one Jewish state, but that for many people is one too many. It's far too big. What do the Jews need all that land for? There's a lovely park in South Africa with all the lions and giraffes and things called the Kruger National Park. It's a really lovely park. The state of Israel is smaller than the Kruger National Park, but it's too big. So we have now this new form of anti-Zionism, about which I think the sharpest comment was made by Amos Oz. He said, in the 1930s, anti-Semites stood up and said, Jews to Palestine. Today, they stand up and say, Jews out of Palestine. They don't want us to be here. They don't want us to be there. They don't want us to be. And that is the first difference. The second difference is that whereas other forms of anti-Semitism, especially the racist kind, were carried by national cultures, so that you could ask, at the time of the Dreyfus affair, let us say, is France an anti-Semitic country? Or you could ask, is Germany, is Austria, is Italy, is Britain an anti-Semitic country? In those days, anti-Semitism was carried by national cultures. And so there were anti-Semitic nations, there were nations that were distinctly not, and so on. Today, there is no such thing as a national culture. Today, anti-Semitism, hate and paranoia in general, but anti-Semitism specifically, is carried by the new global media, which are extremely focused and extremely targeted, so that you can get major incidents of anti-Semitism in a country that is not anti-Semitic at all. Lahavdil, if we take a slightly different look at it, the suicide bombers of Britain of 7/7 Well, after all, they were born in Britain, they lived in Britain, they were educated in Britain. Their own friends and neighbors thought that they were perfectly nice people. They didn't know until after 7/7 and after those video testimonies were shown what deep hatred they had conceived for Britain. So it's very hard to identify. And it's very easy to become very paranoid and say, America thinks this about Britain, that Britain is an anti-Semitic country. They don't realize that there's no such thing anymore as anti-Semitism as a phenomenon of national cultures, unless a politician clearly decides to make that part of the public discourse of politics. And when that happens, as it has happened very recently in the case of Turkey, we're in a very dangerous situation. But the new anti-Semitism, by and large, is not conveyed like the old. And finally, the legitimation of it. We often fail to realize that it is not easy to justify hating people. It really isn't. It's very easy to move people to hate, but it's very hard to make them feel that they are justified in hating. And therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to be legitimated by the supreme source of moral authority in a culture at any given time. And what was the supreme source of moral authority in Europe in the Middle Ages? The church, religion. And therefore, anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages was religious. You could not justify hatred on religious grounds in post-Enlightenment emancipated Europe of the 19th century. What was the highest authority in Europe in the 19th century? The answer was science. Science was the new glittering paradigm. And therefore you will find that 19th century and early 20th century anti-Semitism were legitimated by two, what we now know to be pseudo-sciences. Number one, the so-called scientific study of race, and number two, the so-called science known as social Darwinism. The idea that just as in nature, so in society, the strong survive by eliminating the weak. Today, science is no longer the highest authority because although it has given us unprecedented powers, among those powers are the power to destroy life on earth. So what is the supreme moral authority today? Moral authority. The supreme moral authority since the Holocaust, since the United Nations Universal Declaration in 1948, is human rights. Today, the supreme moral authority is human rights. And therefore, if you are going to justify anti-Semitism, it will have to be by reference to human rights. And that is why in 2001 at Durban, Israel was accused by the human rights NGOs of the 5 cardinal sins against human rights: racism, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity. And those are the 3 things that make the new anti-Semitism different from the old. And now let me tell you what I worry about. In 2003, I think I've got the date right, we persuaded the Conference of European Rabbis and the European Jewish Commission, the EJC, we persuaded the European Union to hold an international conference on anti-Semitism at Brussels in the EU headquarters. When we got there, to my horror, what did I see? The conference hall was full, but at least 95% of those present were Jews. Quite possibly 99% of those present were Jews. And I thought, Rabbana Shalom, is this how you fight anti-Semitism? By telling a whole hall full of Jews that Goyim don't like us very much.